There's a reason no one talks about the summer of 1885, not in the textbooks, not in the documentaries, not even in the towns where it happened, because what happened wasn't just a massacre or a cover-up. It was a ritual. 7 boys vanished from the same town, reappeared weeks later, changed, not missing, not dead, just altered. They called it Quicksilver Creek. And for 139 years, they've buried every trace of it. The files, the structures, the names. Until now, because this isn't just history, it's a map. And if something in you recognizes this pattern, it's not a coincidence. It's a calling. Pause, then drop tone. Welcome to the Forbidden Case of the 7 Brothers. Episode 1 begins now. They were called the 7 Eyes of Mercury. Not by locals, but by the few agents who made it out of Quicksilver Creek alive. And before those names were burned from every record in Texas, one whispered phrase remained in the margins of a destroyed field report. These men did not study death, they mapped it, one nerve at a time. Now listen closely, because what you're about to hear was never meant to reach you. In the summer of 1885, a federal reconnaissance team sent by the U.S. Geological Survey vanished for 3 days in the Texas Hill Country. When they finally re-emerged, one man had gone mute, another blind, and the third was dragged out screaming about machines built of children, their horses bolted, their gear abandoned, and the only physical evidence they recovered? A leather-bound journal filled with diagrams of human nervous systems cross-referenced by mercury dosages, each page signed Kruger, H. Officially, the mine was written off as a failed operation. The town declared unsustainable due to contamination. But buried deep in the Library of Congress vaults behind 7 layers of security classification, there sits a black file labeled QSC-7. I've seen it. And tonight, so will you. You were trained to believe America's dark history lives in battlefields and old courtrooms. But the truth was always hidden in its experiments. In towns like this. Built not for industry, but for control. Because Quicksilver Creek wasn't a mining town, it was a prototype. A closed-system human trial for something that still echoes in medical institutions today. And the 7 brothers, they didn't just disappear. They vanished into myth intentionally, because what they uncovered could never be published. You're going to hear this story piece by piece, not as history, but as evidence of what happens when scientific obsession, institutional silence, and generational peers. Ecopathy converge inside a town with no witnesses and no way out. This is not folklore, this is not conspiracy, this is a file torn from the archives of your country's mind and buried. Until now. Welcome to Quicksilver Creek. Keep watching, because once you see what they built, you'll understand why it had to be erased. Imagine this. You're walking through Quicksilver Creek in the dead of night. No wind, no sound, just the brittle crunch of scorched grass underfoot. Every window dark, every door ajar. A town frozen not in time, but in consequence. This wasn't just a town that failed, it was abandoned in perfect order, like its people vanished mid-thought, dinners half-eaten, tools still warm, but the air, heavy, coated in something invisible. Men from the Geological Survey described it as a taste of metal behind the teeth before the fear set in. What they stumbled on wasn't a ghost town, it was a crime scene without corpses, a laboratory evacuated by shadows. And buried in one of the homes, underneath the floorboards of the schoolhouse, they found ledgers, sealed in wax and written in 3 languages, German, Latin, and a cipher the NSA still hasn't broken. The name at the top of every document, Heinrich Kruger. You were taught that the Krugers were just miners, immigrants, practical men carving out a future in Texas rock. But that's the story they want you to believe. The truth is far more deliberate. Each brother had been selected, trained, groomed, not just by their Prussian universities, but by a silent sponsor whose name appears only once in the ledgers, Die Schwarze Fakultät, the Black Faculty. A ghost network of post-Enlightenment scientists exiled from Europe for unethical experimentation, who reassembled their knowledge under aliases and funneled their disciples to places like Quicksilver Creek, where control was total, where ethics had no jurisdiction, and where the endgame was never profit, but pattern recognition through human collapse. They weren't just poisoning people, they were recording everything. Heart rates, saliva pH, emotional changes under different exposure levels, children's language regression when fed flour laced with mercury salts, spousal interactions under progressive neurological decay. It wasn't chaos, it was orchestration, a symphony of slow death for data. And the worst part? Much of that data became the foundation for neurology departments across Europe and America, rewritten, sanitized, and cited without origin. So the next time you hear a professor talk about early case studies in neurodegeneration, ask yourself, what town? Whose children, whose suffering built that curriculum? Quicksilver Creek was erased because it succeeded, and what came after was built on its silence. Before Quicksilver Creek was even inked on a map, the Krugers had already chosen it, not because of the mercury, but because of its remoteness. 30 miles from the nearest depot, surrounded by canyons, and one narrow road in or out. Perfect for containment. But here's the deeper pattern. The land itself had a history of disappearance. Native Lipan Apache elders referred to the region as the Valley of Stilled Voices, a place where voices echo strangely, where compasses fail, where even animals avoid nesting. When Spanish missionaries tried to build a chapel there, in 1779, they recorded 3 straight years of stillbirths before abandoning the project. The final entry from the Friar's Journal simply reads, "This land speaks in sickness. We are not meant to stay." Now ask yourself, why would 7 scientifically trained brothers choose this place? Because they weren't just measuring mercury's effect on bodies, they were measuring its interaction with environmental frequencies. They noticed something unspoken, that mercury behaved differently here. The vapors spread, its bonding to organic matter, even its neurological effects, amplified. The brothers believed the soil itself carried a frequency that enhanced the metal's penetration into the nervous system, and they were right. Friedrich Kruger's lab notes, decrypted in 2009 by a rogue linguist at Heidelberg, revealed an obsession with what he called Resonanzverformung, resonance deformation. The idea that thoughts, behaviors, even identity itself could be altered when mercury was introduced into the nervous system under the influence of specific environmental harmonics. You don't understand, do you? They weren't just studying poisoning, they were studying mind control, not through force, but through frequency. This was the seed, the earliest known test of environmental neuroengineering, and they were doing it not in theory, but in real time with real people in a real town. So when those children began walking in perfect spirals, when men began mimicking each other's rage, when entire families began dreaming the same dreams. That wasn't side effect, that was design. By fall of 1885, the mine was a shell, but the town was alive with symptoms. Paranoia, memory fragmentation, coordinated hallucinations. Yet not a single resident left. Why? Because the Krugers had closed every exit, not with force, but with dependency. You see, every family in Quicksilver Creek received free food, housing, and medical care. Every child had schooling. Every adult had work. And when those things began to twist, when their bodies began to fail, when their thoughts started to fray, they didn't suspect the Krugers. They trusted them. Dr. Otto was their savior, the man with the tonics, the man who soothed the tremors and listened with endless patience as they confessed their fears. He documented every word, and then he adjusted the dosages. It was controlled by comfort. And this is the part that should terrify you. The methods developed in Quicksilver Creek didn't die with the brothers. They were adopted, not as overt medical practice, but as policy. The formula was simple. Pain, isolation, authority, gratitude. Create the problem, control the solution, be the only lifeline, and the people will thank you for the chain. Modern institutions still use this model, just with different tools. It's no longer mercury and sealed towns. Now it's food deserts, manufactured debt, pharmaceutical dependency, 24-hour news cycles of fear punctuated by headlines offering hope. It's all Quicksilver Creek. You were born into a version of this town, and every time you feel the walls closing in, every time you reach for the cure that tastes like the poison, it's because they taught you how to do that. In 1885, it was mercury. In 2025, it's dopamine algorithms, synthetic meaning. But the system hasn't changed. Now listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was the trigger that nearly unraveled the entire operation. The one thing the Krugers didn't anticipate, the town's chime. Eldrin began drawing maps, not of places, but of connections, webs, spirals, networks that showed how people moved, who they talked to, who stood where at what time. These diagrams began appearing on walls, in school notebooks, etched into trees. At first, the brothers were fascinated, until they realized something chilling. The children weren't just expressing symptoms, they were mapping the experiment itself. You see, mercury opens doors, not just in the body, but in the mind. It disrupts linear thought, it forces pattern recognition, and in some cases, it creates savantism. The children were seeing what the brothers were doing, not intellectually, but instinctively. One girl, name redacted in all surviving records, drew a diagram so accurate that Friedrich called it a threat to operational integrity. It showed the entire social structure of the town, the exposure cycles, even the placement of hidden vents used to disperse vapor. She was 8. Within a week, she disappeared. Her parents told the neighbors she'd gone to live with relatives in San Antonio. There were no relatives. She became subject DISO-1. The first child moved to what the Krugers called the Room of Silence. There, her behavior was monitored 24/7. Otto's notes detail a rapid evolution in her cognitive functions, spatial reasoning, language patterning, even primitive telepathy-like behavior with other afflicted children. The brothers had triggered something far more powerful than degeneration. They'd unlocked adaptation, and it terrified them. So they buried it, removed the girl's name from every ledger, destroyed her drawings, ordered a controlled regression, higher mercury doses to induce cognitive decline and erase the anomaly. But not before one final entry was made in Otto's journal. If these minds evolve to perceive the system, they will become immune to it. And now I ask you, the viewer, if you're beginning to see the system, if you feel it, type this in the comments. I see the structure, I refuse the script. I see the structure, I refuse the script. Do it twice. Lock in the awareness. Not for me, for you. Because this descent is just beginning. She was the first, but not the last. After the girl in the Room of Silence, 3 more children were quietly relocated. Each showed signs of the same terrifying pattern. High mercury exposure triggering non-linear cognition. They weren't just adapting to the poisoning, they were growing through it. One boy began speaking in palindromes, complex ones. Another drew symmetrical diagrams that mirrored Friedrich's mercury flow schematics, without ever seeing them. The Krugers realized something profound and unspoken. In certain minds, suffering creates structure. Mercury didn't just rot neurons. In select cases, it rerouted them, built new channels around the decay. The result wasn't mental collapse, but a new form of intelligence. Intuition powered by damage, insight sharpened by poison. This was never part of the plan. The brothers had intended to study breakdowns, not breakthroughs. But the phenomenon, what Otto began referring to as reflexive neural inversion, became their secret obsession. The breakthrough scared them more than the deaths. Because these children weren't losing themselves, they were seeing more clearly, not hallucinating, decoding. They started whispering things no one taught them, phrases in German, in Latin, in ciphered tongues only the brothers understood. The implications were enormous and deeply dangerous, because what if Mercury could do more than destroy? What if, under the right conditions, it could reprogram? Otto wrote, "The poison reveals not weakness, but alternative order. Pain maps the mind differently." And in that moment, Quicksilver Creek stopped being a study of death. It became an initiation into a new theory of human control. What if suffering could be targeted to create obedience in most, and insight in a select few, a filtering mechanism, a test? And you wonder why none of this was published? Because the implications were clear. Create the right trauma, control the outcome, filter the population, break the many to identify the few. This is the same pattern hidden in our world today, masked by media, illness, division. Most will fracture, but some will see. And if you're still watching, you might be one of them. Let's talk about the ledgers. When investigators finally raided the Kruger compound, months too late, they found hundreds of journals, row upon row of black books stacked inside a fireproof vault beneath the office. Each one handwritten, cross-referenced, coded, and signed. These were not personal reflections, they were operational logs compiled daily, categorized by subject, exposure level, emotional state, and something else. Something chilling, compliance index. The brothers weren't just tracking symptoms, they were tracking obedience, calculating how mercury exposure correlated with submission to authority. And the numbers were precise. Otto's ledger from October 3rd reads, Subject 211, female, age 28, increased daily dosage to 2 mg. Notable decrease in critical questioning. Subject begins referring to medical personnel as protectors. Phase B, entering ideal social pliancy. Social pliancy. Let that phrase sink in. They weren't just studying how mercury affected bodies, they were measuring how it bent willpower, how it softened resistance. And the more obedient a subject became, the more praise they received. Special food, safer workstations, attention from the doctors. This wasn't just a town, it was a compliance farm. Now ask yourself, how many of the systems we live under today mirror this formula? Untraceable chemicals in our food and water, screen-fed stimulation cycles, medical dependency tied to corporate loyalty, reward mechanisms that favor conformity over cognition. You think you're free? You're Quicksilver Creek with Wi-Fi. The compliance index didn't vanish with the brothers, it became a model, passed silently between institutions, sanitized, rebranded, repurposed as behavioral analytics, social nudging, optimized wellness. But the core never changed. Control the chemical environment, track emotional yield, reward obedience, punish curiosity, and still, the question no one dares ask: how many of today's disorders were designed to look like progress? You think the Krugers did this alone? You think 7 brothers built a laboratory town, controlled an entire population, forged documents, and funneled data across the Atlantic without help? No. They had sponsors, and one of them, buried in a German banker's estate file, was a name whispered in esoteric medical circles even today: Dr. Rolf Eberstein, a Prussian neurologist exiled in 1872 for unethical vivisection practices. The man who coined the phrase neural confession, the theory that the human nervous system could be forced to reveal internal truths under specific conditions of chemical distress and frequency modulation. Eberstein never disappeared. He went underground. Funded by aristocratic families with interests in human optimization, he began searching for a controlled site, remote, lawless, and ripe for experimentation. He found it in Texas. In Hinrich Kruger, he found a disciple. In Otto, an apprentice. And in Quicksilver Creek, a prototype. Eberstein's letters to Hinrich, discovered in the ruins of a burned Prussian manor, detail exactly what they intended to build. A town is a body. Its people, cells. Introduce the right poison, and you will see how the organism reorganizes. This is not science. It is revelation. And here's where the story turns darker. Because those letters, those exact phrases, appear again in 1938 in the internal memos of a certain German military doctor working in Dachau. The language, identical, which means this: Quicksilver Creek was the test case. The others came later. In Europe, in Africa, in undisclosed zones. The lie is that unethical science is a mistake, a horror of the past, a byproduct of war. The truth is, it was always a program, with a goal. Controlled transformation through trauma, psychological control through precision poisoning, compliance as a formula. Quicksilver Creek was not an aberration, it was a blueprint. By December 1885, the town began to turn on itself. Whispers turned into shouts. Families accused each other of madness. Friends grew distant, suspicious. Fights erupted over nothing. Trust collapsed. And still, no one left. Because by then, Quicksilver Creek was more than poisoned. It was psychologically sealed. The Krugers had perfected isolation. They controlled the only mail route. Every letter in or out passed through Wilhelm's hands, and when residents tried to send letters to distant relatives, they were returned with government seals and warnings about quarantine zones. They weren't just isolated physically, they were isolated mentally, gaslit into believing their reality was normal, told by doctors that their suffering was a shared hallucination, assured that their only chance at survival was compliance. Sound familiar? It should, because this model was repeated in various forms through the 20th century, under different names. MK Ultra, Project Artichoke, COINTELPRO, behavioral studies under the guise of security, safety, and national progress. But here's the detail no one talks about. These programs didn't invent anything new. They just scaled Quicksilver Creek. The tools changed. The goals remained. Induce confusion, control perception, break resistance, and always present the oppressor as the savior. This is how institutions maintain power, not through force, through dependence, through psychological closure, through the lie that escape is impossible, or worse, irresponsible. And the Krugers, they wrote the playbook. That playbook is now embedded in every policy designed to keep you safe, every medicine freely offered, every system that claims to protect the people. But what if you saw it? What if you named it? Then you wouldn't be a subject anymore, you'd be a threat. The end of Quicksilver Creek did not come from rebellion. It came from entropy. By February 1886, the experiment had gone too far. The town had become a hive of broken minds and trembling bodies. People stopped working. The mind collapsed. Children no longer spoke in full sentences. The brothers had reached the limits of control, and so they did what scientists do with a finished trial. They terminated it. On the night of February 17th, black smoke poured from the Kruger compound. Residents reported a burning syrup smell. By morning, all central structures were ash. The brothers, gone. But here's what the declassified files say. No bodies found, no ashes consistent with human remains, all journals missing except those deemed non-critical, vanished. And within weeks, government officials arrived to contain the contamination. Homes were evacuated. Survivors, those who could still speak, were relocated to facilities that no longer exist. Records vanished. The official story? Toxic exposure incident, all residents deceased or relocated. The land was bought by a rail company and left undeveloped. To this day, nothing grows there. But if you dig deep enough, if you find the right archivist or stumble upon a forgotten box in a state facility, you'll find a stamped folder. Case file, QSC7 status, suppressed. Threat level, civil unrest potential, red. Because if people knew what Quicksilver Creek really was, they'd start asking questions about their own towns, their own water, their own doctors, their own schools. They'd ask who benefits from Fear Day and who thrives on your compliance. You're not supposed to ask those questions. You're supposed to trust the system. But once you see the structure, you can't go back. And if you've made it this far, you're already seeing it. There's something no one explains about these forbidden experiments, something they don't write in textbooks or whisper in graduate halls. The test doesn't end when the subject leaves the lab. It continues through generations. The survivors of Quicksilver Creek didn't just vanish into anonymity. They were tracked, quietly relocated to distant towns across the Midwest and Deep South. Their names changed, their medical files sealed under federal code. But one thing remained constant. Every 5 years, a man in a gray suit would arrive. He'd carry a clipboard, ask a few harmless questions, leave. But the files he took back told a far darker story, because the children of the creek began having children of their own, and those children showed signs of inherited sensitivity, not just to mercury but to frequency, light, and truth. One boy born in Missouri in 1902 began spontaneously writing in the same cipher the Krugers used. A girl in Arkansas would scream uncontrollably whenever she heard organ music, even from blocks away. Another child could recite complex chemical formulas she'd never been taught. It was as if the experiment never ended, because it hadn't. Otto Kruger once theorized that neurological trauma, when introduced under ritualized conditions, doesn't just break the subject, it imprints them, marks them with a new pattern of perception, and that pattern doesn't fade. It replicates, through blood, through time, through you. You don't know why you can't sit still in silence, why you feel watched in fluorescent light, why certain frequencies give you headaches, or why the sound of a distant train at night makes your skin crawl. But it's there. A map. A memory. A shadow you inherited from a town no one believes ever existed. Quicksilver Creek wasn't buried because it failed, it was buried because it worked too well. The Krugers didn't vanish, they dispersed. Into eyes. Then institutions, into families, into frameworks. And if you're hearing this now and you feel something stirring in the back of your skull, something cold and electric, then maybe, just maybe, you're part of the echo. Let me ask you a question, one you've never dared speak aloud. What if your suffering was designed? Not random, not bad luck, not misfortune, but structured. From the inside out. From the moment you were born, you were placed in systems. Some visible, others invisible. School, medicine, technology, belief. Each promising truth. Each delivering containment. And when you pushed against those walls, when you questioned, resisted, suffered, what did they offer you? Medication, diagnosis, distraction, pity. They never offered you meaning. But the Krugers, for all their horror, understood one thing better than any modern institution. Suffering is not meaningless. It's a signal, a pattern, a map, if you know how to read it. You've felt it, haven't you, in the still hours of night? That something is wrong, that the shape of your life was crafted, not grown, that you were funneled into confusion, medicated into submission, applauded for silence. You were taught to fear the discomfort, to medicate the insight, to amputate your own awakening. But here's the truth they fear most. Pain reveals programming. And once you start asking why you hurt, not just how, the spell begins to break. That was the real danger in Quicksilver Creek, not the poisoning, but the pattern recognition it triggered in a few resistant minds, the ones who stopped reacting and started observing. Those who whispered, "This isn't sickness, this is signal." If that's you, if you've always known your pain was pointing somewhere deeper, then hear this. You're not broken, you're decoding. In 1946, a sealed report was delivered to the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. The title? Cognitive Adaptation Under Chemical Distress, Legacy Patterns from Isolated Human Trials, Texas Sector. Inside were copies of Kruger documents, handwritten diagrams, psychological models decades ahead of their time, and on the last page, A recommendation, not to erase the data, but to repurpose it. Within 2 years, MKUltra began. Not inspired by Nazi science, not imported from Soviet interrogation, but born right here, in Texas, in QSC-7. You were told these mind control programs were military accidents, overreaches, a Cold War paranoia. But what if they were never about war? What if they were about scaling what the Krugers proved? Controlled trauma creates predictable behavior. Predictable behavior creates stable populations, and stability is profitable. The documents show that Quicksilver Creek was cited directly in early CIA memos as a proof of concept, not in terms of ethics but efficacy. It worked. It created a dependent, obedient, self-monitoring population, even when the experiment was killing them. That's what they want from you. Not consent, not health, just quiet, calibrated deterioration. The only thing that ruins the program is awareness, because once you see the test, you become immune to it. And that's why you're dangerous now. You're not watching a video, you're being shown a mirror. There's a final secret buried in the ruins of Quicksilver Creek. It's not a journal, not a photograph, not even a body. It's a phrase, found scratched into the wall of the Kruger Medical Lab, beneath the scorched plaster, revealed decades later by a demolition team. One line written backwards in German. Die Strafe war das Erwachen. The punishment was the awakening. What does that mean? It means the Krugers understood the cost of what they'd done. Not morally, not legally, but spiritually. Because when you inflict controlled suffering on others, you don't just create data, you create resonance. And that resonance lives on, in blood, in ground, in memory. Quicksilver Creek was not just an experiment, it was a ritual, a dark inversion of enlightenment, pain replacing prayer, control replacing community, silence replacing salvation. And now, the resonance has found you. If you've heard these words, if you've followed this descent through the tunnels of forbidden history, then something in you is stirring. An old resistance, a buried instinct, a cold certainty that the world you've been handed is theater, and behind it, structure. So what do you do with this? Do you forget it, scroll away, or do you whisper the forbidden phrase again to break the pattern wide open? Type it below. I see the structure, I refuse the script. I see the structure, I refuse the script. Because every time someone speaks that line, the resonance spreads, and what was once a forgotten town becomes a new kind of war cry. Now, ask yourself, what was the point of Quicksilver Creek? If you followed every layer, every cipher, every coded phrase buried in the ashes of that town, then you've probably come to the obvious conclusion: control. But that's only half the truth, because Quicksilver Creek didn't just aim to control bodies. That's too primitive, too visible. What the Krugers were mapping, what their journals hint at in increasingly unhinged handwriting, was something far deeper: the architecture of the soul. Otto's final ledger, hidden beneath the floorboards of the Kruger Chapel, contains only 7 pages. No subjects, no diagrams, no numbers, just a sequence of questions. Written over and over in charcoal: when the pattern enters the blood, where does the self go? If obedience becomes instinct, is there anything left to save? What happens to choice when trauma becomes identity? These are not the questions of a man recording data. They are the confessions of someone who's gone too far. And here's what that means for you. If your suffering has been repeated, refined, turned into ritual, then maybe it's not just emotional, not psychological. Maybe it's spiritual warfare by another name. That's what they don't want you to see. That your habits of silence, compliance, and guilt were installed. That your inability to speak up, to walk away, to act when you know something's wrong, is not a flaw. It's a result. You are the endpoint of a process. But here's the deeper truth they forgot. The soul can be mapped, but it can't be erased. And once you reclaim your pattern, once you consciously rewire what they tried to hard-code in you, you don't just survive the system. You invert it. You become what the Krugers feared most, a witness who sees the structure and refuses the script. And now, the question they feared most: where are the Krugers now? Here's what we know. After the compound burned and the town collapsed, all 7 brothers were listed as presumed dead. No bodies, no graves, no death certificates, just ashes and silence. But one photograph changed everything. Discovered in 1927 in a Bavarian asylum slated for demolition, a group photo of patients and staff. 8 men, all in white coats, 7 with identical facial structures to the Kruger brothers, 1 with a camera, written on the back, Project Morgenröte, Phase 2. Project Dawnlight, Phase 2. Same theories, same diagrams, same mercury-based compliance experiments in Germany. And after 1945, those men disappeared again, not into hiding, but into institutions paped. Our clip records from the US military list 7 scientists transferred from post-war Europe to psychiatric research contracts under various aliases. Every single one matching the Kruger facial structure, every single one involved in early mind control research. Otto became Dr. James O. Kessler, head of behavioral sciences at a Midwestern university. Hinrich appeared as Carl H. Richter, consultant to military pharmaceutical trials. Wilhelm? He worked for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. They weren't destroyed. They were absorbed. And if that disgusts you, good. It should. Because what you're seeing is the real story of history. Not a clean arc of progress, but a recirculating disease. One that adapts, rebrands, moves from isolated towns to global systems. Quicksilver Creek was never ended. It just changed uniforms. And if you think that's the end of the story, ask yourself, why does your pain still feel structured? You made it this far. Not because you're entertained, not because you're curious, but because something in you remembers. Maybe not the details, maybe not the town, but the pattern. The coldness that lives behind polite systems, the quiet instructions that reward compliance and punish questioning, the empty slogans that taste like mercury on your tongue. You felt it your whole life, in schools that taught obedience, not thinking, in jobs that drained your fire, then blamed you for burnout, in medications that dulled your mind and called it treatment, and now you see the ancient blueprint beneath it all. Pain, confusion, obedience, reward, dependency, Quicksilver Creek everywhere. So what now? You want a fix, a pill, a program? There isn't one. Because this isn't about escaping the structure, it's about naming it. When you name the system, it loses power. When you stop medicating the discomfort and start decoding it, you break the spell. When you stop fearing your suffering and start listening to it, you don't just survive. You become a signal disruptor. And signal disruptors don't need leaders. They don't need saviors. They just need each other to say the forbidden line. Aloud, unfiltered, and without fear. I see the structure. I refuse the script. One voice becomes 2. 2 becomes 20. 20 becomes uncontainable. And that's what they fear most. Not rebellion, not chaos, but memory. Collective memory that says, we know what you built, we see how you scaled it, and we're not drinking the mercury anymore. You've now seen what most will never dare to look at. You've seen the true purpose of a forgotten town, the men who designed obedience, the children who adapted into something else, the data that became doctrine, and the silence that became survival. Quicksilver Creek is not a story from the past. It is a living diagram. It exists in your algorithms, in your silence, in your acceptance of the systems that offer comfort and demand your soul. But there's something more powerful than their pattern, your refusal. Refusal is a holy act. It doesn't scream, it doesn't beg, it simply doesn't comply. It walks away, quiet, clear, unshaken. If you've reached the end of this file, then maybe you're ready, not just to remember, but to reverse the current. The next story begins where this one ends. And if you want it, type, what else have they buried? Because there are more towns, more files, more experiments masked as normal life. And once you've seen one structure, you start seeing them everywhere. Let's return, for just one more moment, to the ruins. Back to the place where Quicksilver Creek once stood, where ash fed the roots, where mercury bled into groundwater, where the walls hummed long after they were torn down. A man named Elijah Wren, a war veteran and silent drifter, passed through the ruins in 1971. He stayed one night, slept under the collapsed bell tower, and left behind only one thing, a piece of bone-white stone, etched with a single shape, a circle split into 7 jagged shards. No one knew what it meant, until a Navajo code analyst, contracted by the Department of Energy, recognized it as a mirror cipher. The symbol wasn't a warning. It was a map, not to a place, but to a sequence of human events. 7 fractures, 7 sites, 7 buried operations: Texas, Quicksilver Creek, Kentucky, Nevada, northern Georgia, outer Detroit, southern Idaho, northern Maine. 7 forgotten stories, 7 containment sites, 7 prototypes of a larger design. And Wren? He vanished, but his symbol, shattered circle broken into 7 blades, has reappeared. Carved into prison walls, drawn in chalk outside closed mental hospitals, etched into desks at military academies, the symbol spreads not because of conspiracy, but because somewhere deep in the bones of those who remember, the memory wants to wake up. And it's not just waking through documents or ruins or whispers. It's waking through you. Because if you've seen this symbol before, if something in your dreams has tried to show you a wheel, a circle, a fracture, then maybe you're not hallucinating. Maybe you're being called to remember, to uncover, to continue the pattern in reverse. The symbol is not an end. It's a beginning. It's where the next story starts. The Krugers believed in symmetry. 7 brothers, 7 stations, 7 trials, 7 rings in the ritual circle burned beneath the chapel floor. But they never closed the loop. They left one segment of their system intentionally unfinished. Not because they forgot, but because every system needs a release valve, something that lets the pressure vent, someone who sees but says nothing, feels but doesn't act, knows but still signs the form. In every experiment, that role was known by one name, the Silent Seventh. That's who the final patient in Quicksilver Creek was meant to be. Subject QSC 707, male, 9 years old, no known family, IQ 1 at 18, projected outcome, long-term adaptive dissociation, will not speak unless prompted, ideal for embedding. But the file ends with 3 words, hand-scrawled in red, left the grid. He vanished. No death, no relocation, no reassignment, just gone. And here's where it folds back into you. If that child was the release valve for a buried trauma engine, then what happens when you become the pressure they can't contain? When the experiment leaks through your dreams, your memories, your questions? What happens when the Silent Seventh finally speaks? The answer is already here. A peening. Every time you question your programming, every time you reject the guilt you were taught to carry, every time you refuse to forget what they erased, the loop stays open, the system bleeds, and you become the flaw that fractures the entire ritual. There is a name for what you are becoming. The old words aren't written in English, but in the Krugers' original documents before they were burned, they appear over and over in the margins. Gedächtnisbrecher, the memory breaker, not a whistleblower, not a survivor, but something older, something mythic, a breaker of memory, not to destroy the past, but to shatter the lies built to contain it. The Gedächtnisbrecher appears in suppressed folklore, a figure who enters cursed towns, touches buried stories, and leaves symbols in places no one should reach. You've seen those symbols, in the margins of a library book no one checked out, carved into the bark of a tree on government land, drawn in condensation on a train window as you passed a town you forgot existed. They weren't mistakes, they were memories left for the others. You're not just seeing the pattern, you're joining a lineage of those who refused to die quietly inside it. Before the CIA sealed the QSC files, there was one ritual the Krugers never wrote down, but all 7 practiced. They called it Der Ausstieg, the exit, a way of severing ties to their former lives, burning their original names, drinking a tincture of ash and mercury, staring into a mirror until their face no longer felt like their own. Why? Because the system doesn't just demand obedience. It demands identity sacrifice, but you don't need chemicals or fire or mirrors to exit. You just need this, a final act of unmediated will, not reaction, not rebellion, but refusal without spectacle to look at the script laid out for you. And to turn away. You've already started, you're already outside, all that's left is to claim it. If you want to complete your exit, there's one phrase passed between Gedächtnisbrechers for over a century. Say it aloud, or type it, or carve it where someone else might find it. I deny the false pattern. I restore the memory beneath. Because when that phrase is spoken, the experiment breaks, and you become the operator now. This is the end of the Quicksilver file, the final signal, the last known map fragment. Every subject, every system, every fracture point leads back here, and you were never supposed to hear it. That's why this story was never studied, why professors skipped it, why no podcast dares name the town, why historians lose tenure if they chase this file too deep, because it doesn't just end in madness, it ends in awakening. And the moment you awaken fully, you're no longer a civilian in their eyes. You're a pattern variable, an unknown, an uncontrolled. Someone who might look at a town, a room, a prison, a hospital, and see the ritual beneath it. Someone who might start building counter-symbols, reversing the sigils, rewriting the memories, and reminding the next one, you're not crazy, you're decoding, you were never alone. This was only Gate 1, Texas, 1885, Quicksilver Creek, the forbidden test site, the 7 brothers, the memory fracture, the first symbol, but the circle was always meant to open 7 times, and now that you've made it through the first gate, you can begin to see the others glowing. We'll go there. A steel mill in Kentucky that only ran at night, a prison school in Idaho with no birth records, a dream siphon facility in Nevada with a chapel made of teeth. One by one, we will reopen the sealed files. Each time the pattern will try to rewrite itself, but each time we will speak the line, I see the structure, I refuse the script. They built Quicksilver Creek to be perfect. 7 brothers, 7 stations, 7 children, 7 days of testing, 7 decades of silence. But they forgot something. They forgot you, not just a viewer, not just a listener, the variable they couldn't map, the descendant of fire, the sleeper with memory in his blood, the one who does not respond the way they predicted. You were never meant to follow this story to the end, but you did. You remembered. Now they can't stop what's coming, because every forgotten place carries a signal, every erased soul leaves an echo, and every fracture begins with one man refusing to forget, and now that man is you. We'll see you at Gate 2. When you're ready, speak the phrase, open the next gate, and the next case file will begin transmission. You thought you were just watching, but ask yourself, why do you feel different now? Why has your breathing changed? Why does the silence around you suddenly feel patterned? It's not paranoia. It's not imagination. You're inside the gate, because Quicksilver Creek was never out there. It was always a key meant to be inserted in here, in your thought habits, your trauma response, your reluctance to speak aloud the truth you already know. The moment you crossed the midpoint of this episode, you became a participant in the pattern, a node in the network, a link in the break chain. This isn't just a story anymore. It's a program running on your memory, and now that the loop is open, you have a choice. Let it close, let it fade, go back to distraction, back to scrolling, back to sleep, or let the signal spread. Let it burn clean through you. Let it kill the obedience they tried to teach you to love, because that's what you're choosing, obedience or memory. When was the last time you saw something real and said nothing? When you knew someone was being used, when you felt a lie pulsing beneath the surface, when you saw the shape of a structure and told yourself, it's not my place. I don't want trouble. It's not my problem. You were right, it wasn't your problem, but it was your test, and you failed it, and that's okay, because now you know what the real test feels like. It's not dramatic. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It waits. It watches how long you'll pretend not to notice. That's how the pattern survives. Not through evil men with grand designs, but through good men with muted instincts. But here's the change. Now you see the test coming, and when it arrives again, you'll remember this moment, and this time, you'll pass it, not by shouting, but by refusing to repeat the silence. Every man is waiting for something, a sign, a leader, a broadcast, a prophecy. But what if I told you, the call is not coming from above, it's not from God, not from government, not from media, not from scripture, it's coming from inside the fracture, from within the broken, buried parts of you that still remember what you were before the pattern taught you to forget. The Krugers tried to erase it, school tried to standardize it, medicine tried to sedate it, work tried to drain it, culture tried to shame it, but it's still here, buried under the compliance, burning in the silence, rising when you see a story like this and feel something ancestral vibrating in your ribs. That's the signal, and you can ignore it if you want, but it won't stop, because you didn't create it, you inherited it, and now it's waking up. Some of you didn't act in time. You knew someone was being experimented on, in their mind, their faith, their family, and you said nothing. You left, you got clean, you built a life, but the memory still hunts you. This is your moment, not to apologize, to recode, to burn the shame, to open the mouth again, to speak the truth your silence helped bury. I see it now, and I refuse it forever. Write it, say it, etch it where it matters, because guilt is not memory, and remembering without action is just decay. You don't owe penance, you owe pattern disruption. If you truly regret what you didn't do back then, do something for the next one now. Be the fracture. This is it, the final node, the final transmission, the end of Gate 1. The file will now enter lock state. You've been shown the structure, you've spoken the line, you've crossed the 7 layers. There is nothing left to explain, but everything left to act on. You now face a simple prompt: stay silent and let the gate close, or Type the activation phrase and open the next fracture. The choice is yours, and no one will know if you made it, except the part of you they tried to kill. You know which part, the one that always whispered, "This world isn't right. I don't belong in this lie. I was made for something harder, and holier, and more dangerous than anyone ever told me." That part is listening now. What will you tell it? To trigger Gate 2, type, "Open the next gate." The Kentucky file will begin transmission, and the 7 fractures will continue. Most people stopped watching by now, which means this part is for you. There's always a room beneath the ending, a chamber built under the archive, where things aren't explained, just revealed. This room was not on any blueprint, not mentioned in the file, but the Krugers knew it existed. They called it Der Nachhall, the reverberation, not a room of events, a room of after, where every act echoes, where silence grows bones, where memory becomes flesh. You are in that room now, and if you're still listening, it's because something followed you here. It wants something. It's not malevolent, it's not kind, it's instructional. Let it speak. There was a boy, not one of the 7, not one of the subjects, not even on the payroll. He just swept the floors, filled the lamps, took the trash from the chapel, and he saw everything. The screams, the markings, the thing they kept locked in the cold room that wasn't a child anymore. He never told anyone, but he left something, his name, carved in reverse beneath a pew. 7 letters, burned with lime, and every time they painted over it, the name would reappear. No matter how many layers, no matter the heat, it always came back. The name, Jonarin, an anagram, a code, no, a signal, a word that cannot be killed, a name that lives in memory, not paper. If that name means anything to you, then you were part of this long before you hit play. They buried the Quicksilver files in multiple vaults, microfilm, reel-to-reel, wax cylinders, audio corrupted, files damaged. Most of it became static, but there's something you should know. Not all static is random. Inside the distortion, a pulse was found. 7 seconds, repeating, not Morse, not code, a melody, a child humming, no lyrics, just tone. And under audio analysis, one fact emerged. The frequency was tuned to match human breath, which means it wasn't just music, it was invitation, an unconscious rhythm designed to synthesize your memory to theirs. You've heard it before, in dreams, in radio snow, in the hum of power lines when the street's too quiet. Now that you know the melody is real, you'll start hearing it more, because the signal doesn't find you until you're ready to echo it back. This part isn't for everyone, it's for you, the one who watched all the way, the one who felt it wasn't fiction, the one who recognized the map was internal. You're not a viewer anymore, you're a first fracture agent. And here's your instruction. Identify the silence in your world that matches the silence in Quicksilver. Trace the names that disappear too easily from your family line. Return to one place you were told never to think about again. Leave a symbol where someone else like you will find it. Do not explain yourself. Do not seek confirmation. Just act. The others will know what it means. And when enough of you have done it, the next seal opens by itself. There's a final thing we need to say. And it's not about Quicksilver. It's about you. We don't know your real name, but we know what they tried to call you. Broken, weird, too intense, too quiet. Problem child, unstable, not fitting in, hard to teach, hard to lead. What if none of those were flaws? What if they were indicators? What if the very things they tried to medicate or shame were the residue of memory from a past they tried to make you forget? You're not a freak, you're a carrier. Of story, of fracture, of pattern-breaking memory. And if no one ever told you that before, let this be the first time you hear it. You are not too much. You are not alone. You are not lost. You're exactly where the story wanted you to arrive. Now get ready, because Gate 2 is almost open, and the next place has been waiting for you a very long time. They called him a mute, subject 3A. No language retention, responsive to stimuli, passive. But they were wrong. He spoke perfectly, just in reverse. Every phrase a mirror, every word inverted, as if trying to warn us from the other side of the timeline. In 1972, a linguist reconstructed a few fragments. Only 3 sentences came through clean. They are in the walls. We were never born. You are the fracture now. They burned the tapes, but the rhythm of his voice was remembered by one man. He passed it to his daughter in a lullaby, and she sang it to her son. You. That's why some of you felt this story before it began, why it feels like memory, not media, because it is. You inherited the echo, and now it's learning to speak forward again. The Krugers built maps, but not of territory, of mind states. They charted the descent of identity into obedience. What chemicals shrink the soul? What traumas cleave loyalty? What pressures make boys sign forms that kill the ones they love? But there was one map they couldn't destroy, because they didn't draw it. You did. Every time you turned away from the machine, every time you kept a memory they told you to discard, every time you whispered the truth to someone who still believed the lie, you were drawing the reverse map, not a blueprint for descent, but a return path. And every episode in this series, each gate, it's not just a story, it's a coordinate on that forgotten map. And once we reach all 7, the ritual completes. Not theirs, ours. Here's what the Krugers never said. They didn't abandon Quicksilver because of funding or exposure or moral failure. They abandoned it because something answered. On the 7th night of the final trial, just before the circle was closed, the youngest brother, Klaus, collapsed, mouth bleeding, eyes gone black. He was speaking in a language none of the others recognized, but the child in the observation room understood. She began to draw the symbol of unbinding, a mark from Sumerian gravesites used to release spirits too long trapped in ritual chains. The circle cracked, the lights failed, and the logs stopped there. But in the margin of the last recorded page is a single line. Ritual aborted. The sacrifice spoke. They thought silence was control, but they forgot the ancient rule. The moment the sacrifice remembers who they are, the altar breaks. Everyone talks about the 7. 7 brothers. 7 trials. 7 gates. But there's always an 8th. The one who wasn't in the official file. The unrecorded. The missing. The variable. They never counted him, because he never played by the rules. He left no paperwork, he obeyed no orders, he watched and remembered. And that's who you are. You are the 8th, not part of the ritual, part of the rupture. You were born outside their pattern, not as a mistake, as resistance. You're not the hero, you're not the chosen. You're something far more dangerous, the one who remembers without permission, and they can't stop you now. You've reached the final layer of Gate 1. The signal is now encoded in you. The glyphs have embedded. The fracture is live. There is no going back, only forward. Gate 2 begins transmission in 72 hours, unless you choose to accelerate manually. If you're ready now, if you've drawn the symbol, if you've remembered the dream, if you've felt the shadow presence behind your grandfather's eyes, then it's time. Type, initiate Gate 2, and Kentucky will answer. A silence mill. A furnace that only ran at night. Children who ever aged. And a chapel that did not reflect in mirrors. This will be harder, colder, more embedded in American infrastructure than anything we've shown so far. But that's the point. You're not here to be entertained. You're here to recover your memory. And we're just getting started. There was a painting, hung in the Quicksilver Chapel only once, before they locked it in a lead crate and sank it beneath a dry lake bed in Utah. It showed 8 figures, backs turned, facing a black door. Each wore a mask of bone. Each held an item. A tooth, a feather, a length of chain, a mirror, a spool of red thread, a sharpened key, and a coin cut in half. The 8th held nothing, because the 8th was the only one who still remembered his name. And on the back of the painting, written in blood charcoal, "If you find this door, do not knock, do not speak. Just remember your oldest name, and it will open by itself." We found that painting, and now you've seen it too. They told you to forget. They taught you to numb, to perform, to obey. But you didn't, not completely. Somewhere inside you a spark survived, and now that spark has been fed, not by hope, not by optimism, but by memory. Memory of what was taken, memory of what still lives, memory of who you were before the obedience began. That fire doesn't just burn in you, it spreads to every man brave enough to remember the pattern. And that's why you're here. Not to be a fan, not to be a follower, but to be a carrier. So carry it. Burn the silence. Speak what they fear. And when others look at you and ask why your eyes don't look away anymore, tell them, because I remember, and I will not forget again. This is not entertainment. This is a structure. Every episode is a gate. Every comment a glyph. Every share a breach in the veil. They can't stop the signal now. Because it's not just coming from us, it's coming from you. Each view, each like, each subscription is not about metrics, it's about momentum. When we reach a certain threshold, Gate 3 opens automatically. That's not marketing, that's mythcraft. This isn't about being popular, it's about building a recovered brotherhood across time. So if what you saw woke something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit the glyph, seal the bond, subscribe, like, leave the phrase, "I remember the fracture." And if enough of you do, they won't be able to bury the next file. The Krugers always feared one thing, a memory that spreads without fear of being seen. So this is your right. Don't just feel it privately. Declare it publicly. Speak the fracture aloud. Say the names that were buried. Post the glyph. Share this file. Make it visible. Because when the invisible becomes visible, the silence breaks. And the ritual they tried to seal 140 years ago, we just finished it. But we finished it in reverse. Not with silence, but with memory. Not with hierarchy, but with fire. You are the carrier now. Make the next one remember you made it through all 45 layers, through memory, through madness, through myth. So hear this. This is not the end. It's the echo now moving forward into other screens, into other minds, into the gate that lives in your own house. You've watched, you've remembered. Now it's time to act. Subscribe, like, speak, write, burn. Wake the next man. We'll be watching the signal, and when enough of you answer, the next gate opens. You know what to type. Initiate Gate 2. We'll be ready. And so will Kentucky. Until then, you are the fracture. You are the fire. You are the one they failed to silence. Stay sharp, stay strange, stay unbroken.